Hi, my name is Jessica Hall and I am part of the 2020 Lemelson cohort. My research is on the allure of Western-themed environments in suburban Shanghai and the reconstruction of space. During the summer of 2019, I traveled to Shanghai to study their One City, Nine Towns development project and gain some insight into this phenomena of Western-themed environments in Shanghai. However, before we proceed, I want to provide some context on Shanghai's history and how this context makes it unique. The colonial period in Shanghai began in 1862 and ended in 1941. Colonialism had a large influence on the architecture in Shanghai due to the British and French occupancy. The most notable is the creation of shikamen that were designed by Europeans for Chinese seeking asylum within their walls, and it married the designs of both Western and Chinese culture. The entrance of these buildings faced the south, similar to how it would in a traditional Chinese courtyard. After the People's Republic of China took over and foreigners were kicked out, due to the amount of housing need, people were assigned homes in these colonial districts. Years later, in 1978, under Deng Xiaoping, China's economic reforms began, resulting in the rise of the Chinese middle class and the growth of the free market in China. This led to, in 1998, housing no longer being allocated to people. This allowed people to now have control over where and how they lived. As a result, the newly affluent used housing as a way to express their individuality and freedom. From this desire, we can begin to understand why developments such as these towns began. A product of Chinese 10th five-year plan for urban development and marketed to the Chinese middle class, Shanghai's One City, Nine Towns development was intended to create new residential communities and spaces for local tourism. This would promote a global image of Shanghai. For my study, I focused on 5 of the 9 towns, looking at Lodian, a Scandinavian-themed town, Anting, a German-themed town, Songjiang, a British-themed town, Songjiang, a British-themed town, Puzhang, an Italian-themed town, and Gaoqiao, a Holland-themed town. This here is a visual to provide a little insight into what these towns look like. What piqued my interest in these towns is how Western media responded to them. From article titles alone, we see terms questioning these towns' validity. By referring to them as copycats, bizarre, or knockoffs, it indicates a distinct differentiation between the original and it attacks these towns' value by using a Western perspective of trying to understand their creation. However, my own experiences made me question this very Eurocentric manner of understanding replication in China. In 2014, I had the opportunity to study Chinese in Hangzhou. A major landmark in the city is the West Lake, and almost every day me and my classmates would go visit there and hang out. The sight of it left a big impression on me, and when the program brought us to Beijing, I was surprised about how much the Kunming Lake at the Summer Palace reminded me of the West Lake. When I brought it up to our tour guide, she explained that the Kunming Lake was created by extending an existing body of water in order to replicate Hangzhou's famous lake. Remembering this experience made me begin to question the media's dismissal of these towns as simple replications, and I began to wonder, is the allure of these towns for residents actually what's being presented in the media? And what is the value of these towns to people living in them? To answer this question, I utilized 4 different methods in my research: participant observation, interviews, street surveys, and photography. And I discovered 3 key points. The first being the better life. In these towns, you'll find many examples of Western architectural forms. For example, this building in Lodian that utilizes a Grambo roof, also known as a Dutch roof. It is popular in classical American architecture and is found in Georgian and Dutch-style homes. Another example is this hospital in the same town, which utilizes modern fantasy castle architecture, which is a stark contrast to the medieval castle architecture that uses thick walls to withstand an attack. And these type of castles are built more for design rather than defense. And lastly, the People's Court in Puzhang, which utilizes this historicism architecture. This style is intended to recreate historic styles, And you can see in this photo the mix of the Baroque and Romanesque inspiration from the columns at the entrance and the combination of strong concave and convex forms that create texture. When I asked residents about areas where European architecture is present, no one brought up these towns, despite the fact that we were surrounded by the features I just pointed out. Instead, people associated European architecture with the Bund and French concessions. My participants said things like, I remember in the Bund area, I saw a lot of European architecture. And Shaogang Road in the concessions, I remember, has a lot of European architecture. And since people weren't drawn to these towns for the aesthetic, I asked them, why did you move here? And I found that overwhelmingly, a lot of people were moving there for the quality of life. My participants cited things such as, it's better to raise my son here. The air is good and it's pretty. It's not as busy, it's better. Here is less crowded than the city center, and there are various facilities here that make it convenient. In almost all my interviews, this topic of the towns being better was brought up in some capacity. But what makes these towns better? Using housing variables, part of Wang and Li's research in Beijing, as a guideline, I tried to determine if these notions of better coincided with their own in any way. I found that my most frequent responses on why these towns are better than the city center were green belts, improved air quality, proximity to quality hospitals and school, and even parking. All of these indicate an emphasis on living convenience and an improved quality of life. This result directly contrasts to the narrative on why. Additionally, while my participants never explicitly claimed other areas were inferior, by labeling certain areas as better, they are still identifying another area as worse. Inadvertently, this better label provides insight to how residents are socially distinguishing themselves and is an extension of how my participants perceive themselves in society. Secondly, these towns aren't just copies of Western environments. There are still long-established ideals of Chinese life present in the architecture of the homes. For example, in these new gated communities, we see that the branching layout of shikumen is still being utilized. Additionally, the directional positioning and building orientation of these new homes still follow the structure of traditional courtyards where the entrance faces the south, indicating a continued emphasis on feng shui and home design. The most notable difference between these two photos is that there is no cars in the gated living community, and also there is more greenery. Anting Newtown is an example of how important feng shui remains in Chinese architecture and what happens when it's deviated from. When exploring a housing compound, I observed that the buildings whose entrance did not face the south were often vacant. In comparison, buildings in the compound that did prescribe to this southern building orientation had residents living in them. This indicates that there is a preference for these southern-oriented buildings over non-southern oriented buildings. As a result, many of these non-south-facing buildings were undergoing some construction to alter the entrance direction, as shown in the photo here. By actively rejecting buildings that do not meet long-established ideals of Chinese life present in the architecture, it becomes apparent that these towns are still shaped by traditional expectations. It shows that despite the living conveniences in the area, building orientation is not a secondary factor to those living in these towns. People are reshaping these developments to best fit and meet their cultural lifestyle expectations, indicating that these towns, while themed, are not just copies or reproduction of Western cityscapes. Lastly, I found that these towns are segregated both economically and physically, creating distinct segregated lines between classes. Revisiting this idea of quality of life, there is a very transparent issue. These towns are marketed at a new middle class, and the resources that make these towns appealing are only available if you can afford it. Thus, universally important resources such as cleaner air and good hospitals are not equally accessible. Even though parks, malls, hospitals, and schools are available to the public, it is only if they have the means to get to these areas. However, these towns take 1 to 2 hours to reach from the city center using public transportation. If a person does not have access to a car, that is a substantial distance to travel just for these resources. While they're not explicitly barring people from entering, because the primary mode of transportation for the average Chinese person is a subway or motorbike, not cars, it takes a lot more effort to reach these areas. However, there are nuances. The size of the town appears to have a very interesting impact. To provide some perspective on size, on this map you have Lodian Town and Gaoqiao. As you can see, Gaoqiao is not even 1/4 of Lodian, and Puzhang Town, while not shown, is even larger. In these smaller Western themed towns such as Anting, Gaoqiao, and Thamestown, access is more blurred and awareness of Western themed architecture and the segregation of space is handled a bit differently. For example, in Gaoqiao, the river, which is represented by this line here, is where the socioeconomic divide is most apparent. On the left side, there are somewhat older housing compounds, and to the right across the river, there is Hollandtown, with Dutch steep gables on its roof and even a windmill sitting in the water. Due to this visible contrast in design, it appears that more people are aware of this town's themed nature. Furthermore, unlike the larger towns whose distance from the city impacts its physical segregation, in these smaller towns, people of lower economic status can cross the street and eliminate this divide and share access to some of the resources these towns provide. However, when looking at the two photos at the top of the slide, we see that there is a difference in living environment. These nicer living environments and the economic exclusion to them are examples of how the middle class continue to socially distinguish themselves. This creates a social structuralism that is only able to be consumed by those that have the wealth to participate. Thus, the manifestation of their desire to distinguish themselves is reconstructing the social space in Shanghai. When we look beyond the facade of these towns, we discover that they are far more complex. Residents are drawn to these towns not because of its architecture, but because of the improvement in their quality of life. Therefore, contrary to the discourse in popular opinion, the development of these towns are not due to the Chinese desire to westernize, and these communities/towns are constantly being shaped and reshaped to fit the residents' needs and expectation of Chinese life. Overall, what makes the creation of these towns important is that they are a reflection of Chinese growing middle class lifestyle ideals, and also China's growing social economic divide. Thus, these towns provide an unexpected entrance into a major social issue in China. Thank you for watching, and I would like to give thanks to my advisor, Dr. Yen, Dr. Robert Lemelson, Dr. Troop, Dr. Boom, my Lemelson professors throughout the past 2 years, my translators for this project, Ms. Jin, my participants, my 2020 Lemelson cohort, my family and friends, and all the people who supported me through this process. I couldn't have done this without you, and I really appreciate it.